Trump has not denied, much less shown remorse for his actions. Instead, he, quote, proudly takes credit for overturning Roe.
Thanks to these justices, we have also achieved what the pro-life movement fought to get for 49 years, and we've gotten abortion out of the federal government and back to the states.
Both sides of the presidential race highlighting the 2-year anniversary of the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade. Meanwhile, the court is set to make another key ruling, possibly as soon as this week, that could have a major impact on the criminal cases against former President Trump. The court is considering claims by Trump that he is immune from prosecution for alleged crimes he committed in office. The Hill White House reporter Brett Samuels joins us to discuss. Brett, it seems unlikely the court would say the president could say, order the assassination of a rival. The question is, where could they draw the line?
That is the big question here. And certainly, as you said, there are pretty significant potential ramifications. Obviously, we're still waiting for the former president's criminal cases to go forward at the federal level in both Florida and Washington, D.C. So, if the Supreme Court comes out and rules that the former president is immune, or the presidents are immune from prosecution for acts, while they are president, then that essentially unravels a lot of these criminal charges against Trump over his handling of classified documents, which is the case in Florida, as well as his conduct around the 2020 election, which is the case in Washington, D.C. As you said, the question is where they will draw the line. Could they come back and say, that some of his conduct should be immune from prosecution? Would that then in turn potentially unravel some of these charges, but not all of them? So certainly this bears watching. It's, coinciding with the first presidential debate coming up this week. So, certainly a really significant decision coming forward from the Supreme Court that could have lasting ramifications, not just for Trump, but then for future presidents looking forward.
Yeah, and what impact could the ruling have on the criminal cases? I think the question that everyone wants to know is, are there any chance that another one of these trials happens before Election Day?
Yeah, at this point, it seems extremely unlikely that Trump goes to trial in any of these cases before Election Day, because the Supreme Court has taken up these immunity claims from Trump and his team, because, they have waited essentially to rule on this, because they've taken their time issuing this ruling until June. It's very unlikely that the case in Washington, D.C. in particular, which is the case that appeared to be on track to happen before the election, there just wouldn't be enough time in the 4 months essentially between now and Election Day for that to go to trial. Regardless of what the Supreme Court says, those cases aren't likely to happen for Election Day. The question is whether they could happen if Trump loses. Could they get underway shortly thereafter?
Now, when it comes to this immunity decision, Democrats say President Biden will respect the court's ruling. Brett, they say that's a sharp contrast from Trump's lack of respect for the rule of law.
Certainly, that's something that I think, the White House and Democrats want to draw this contrast between President Biden, who has routinely said, even if he disagrees with the court, he respects their rulings, or he'll abide by their rulings. In this case with the immunity case, saying that he'll respect that ruling. Now Republicans would sort of point to the idea that Biden has criticized the Supreme Court over some of their rulings, certainly on gun issues. He's been critical. Student loan debt, for example, the Supreme Court struck down Biden's original plan, and Biden has just kind of gone with plan B, gone with a different route to try and secure that student loan debt forgiveness. So I think we'll see some sniping either way from both sides over sort of who really respects the court, who will respect their opinion. But certainly the White House and Democrats are trying to set this up that, you won't see a lot of pushback or sort of criticism from President Biden, depending on when the Supreme Court comes down with this ruling.
And the Supreme Court also deciding to take up a case challenging a ban on gender-affirming care for transgender minors. Case comes out of Tennessee. Brett, the court seemed hesitant to weigh in on this issue in the past. Why are justices taking up the case now?
Yeah, this is the first time that we're seeing the Supreme Court agree to take up a case on this issue, even though for the last couple of years it's really been very front and center. Something that Republican legislatures at the state level have really pushed through these laws in the last few years, sort of restricting gender-affirming care. It's been certainly a very front and center issue on both sides of the aisle. But to your point, I think what we're seeing here is the Supreme Court finally agreeing to take this case. Certainly, it sort of reached this point of critical mass where I think it was impossible to ignore really going forward. Now, they're taking it up on the grounds of this argument that it amounts to discrimination on the basis of sex, which would violate the Constitution. So we will see the Supreme Court weigh in on this very hot button issue during their next term. And depending on what they rule, it will have widespread ramifications, not just for this Tennessee law, but then potentially for other states that have pursued similar laws.
Former President Trump says he has his VP pick, but he's not telling anyone just yet. Brett, who are thought to be the front runners? What do each of them bring to the table? And when do we expect Trump to make this announcement?
Yeah, the former president certainly kind of has turned this into quite the guessing game, quite the parlor game. He's really teased out details about who's on his short list, when he might announce. And he knows, obviously, that there's a lot of interest and intrigue around this in Washington. So at this point, from what I've been told from sources close to Trump and in his orbit, Doug Burgum, the North Dakota governor, Senator Marco Rubio of Florida, and Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio are considered sort of the three top tier front runner candidates, where one source close to Trump told me that, however it shakes out, they would be shocked if it wasn't one of those three candidates. Now, Trump's campaign has vetted some others like Tim Scott, the senator from South Carolina, Rep. Elise Stefanik from New York, Congressman Byron Donalds, Ben Carson, the former housing secretary. But those candidates are sort of on the fringe at this point, not really considered to be amongst the front runners. And as far as timing, it appears to be a little fluid. Trump has said that he could announce at the Republican convention in Milwaukee next month, but some folks who I've talked to have suggested that he might be better off announcing sooner to generate more buzz going into the convention and generate a little more excitement. But certainly in the next couple of weeks, we'll see sort of the final announcement here from Trump.
Yeah, meanwhile, Democrats are trying to stamp out any remaining skepticism that President Biden will be the party's presidential nominee. Ahead of Thursday's Biden-Trump debate, there's been speculation in the media that if Biden does poorly, there could be a move to replace him on the Democratic ticket. But it seems like from all the party insiders that we're speaking to, that there is really no plan B.
Yeah, this has been sort of a persistent rumor, I guess, for lack of a better term, this idea that Democrats will try and replace President Biden. They will pressure him to step down from the ticket and pick either Kamala Harris or another candidate to replace him atop the ticket. That's been something that even Republicans have consistently floated over the past year or two, this idea that Michelle Obama or someone might replace Biden. But Democrats consistently have batted down those rumors. They've said there's no plan. Certainly, President Biden and his team have shown no indication that they have any plans to step down. So, even if there were this sort of private grumblings among Democrats, that would just lead to this huge, messy fight within the party. So really, there's just no momentum for this to actually happen. Obviously, the Democratic convention will happen in August. And that's when President Biden will be formally nominated. But, until then, we'll just continue to hear Democrats say that there's no change in plans and that President Biden is their guy.
Let's talk about young voters. There's been a lot of news that President Biden, his support is lagging among young voters behind levels that he saw in 2020. But a new CBS YouGov poll shows that Biden has a nearly 25-point lead among voters under 30. Does this show Biden is improving his standing within that block of voters?
Yeah, the polling has been sort of, to your point, a little all over the map as far as whether Trump is really making strong inroads, whether Biden is sort of solidifying his gains in recent weeks. This latest YouGov poll, I think, underscores that the Biden campaign has really made a concerted effort to sort of reach out to young voters, to try and meet them where they are. They've held events all across the country to try and connect with young voters. They've certainly done voter outreach. They've engaged with influencers on social media. They've been on TikTok. All these different ways the Biden campaign has tried to reach out to young voters because at the end of the day, young voters, voters of color, those are kind of the bread and butter of Biden's base, where he really needs those voters to turn out in November if he's going to beat Donald Trump again. The Trump campaign has sort of touted that they've made inroads with these groups, but ultimately, I think this is an area where the Biden campaign is really focused on solidifying their strengths with these groups. And that latest poll, I think, indicates that work.
Now, Tuesday does mark 2 years since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, upending the constitutional right to an abortion. The Biden campaign is out with a new video pointing out that it was Trump's Supreme Court appointments that provided the pivotal votes. Brett, this is sure to be a focus of Democrats throughout this campaign.
Absolutely. The anniversary of that Supreme Court ruling is just sort of the latest instance of Democrats really trying to take advantage of, reminding voters, using moments like the anniversary of the court overturning Roe to put this back front and center, put it back in the spotlight, make sure that voters are aware that, as you said, these are Donald Trump's Supreme Court appointments who led to the end of Roe v. Wade, remind voters that Republicans have opposed votes to protect contraception, remind voters where Republicans stand on IVF treatment, and remind voters that Donald Trump has, essentially said that states enacting individual abortion bans, cases like Florida, Texas, where they are really, really restrictive, that Donald Trump has praised those and said the system is working as it should when states are enacting those kinds of laws. So, this is sort of going to be a steady drumbeat, I think, until November, where Democrats are really pounding this message home. And this anniversary is just kind of the latest instance where we're seeing this sort of full-fledged push between statements from the Biden campaign, ads from the Biden campaign, Vice President Harris hitting the road to Arizona and Maryland. So expect to hear more of this between now and November because Democrats believe that it is really a winning issue for them.
South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem says pardons for people convicted of crimes in the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol should be considered on a case-by-case basis, adding that the country doesn't want to see another January 6. Now, Noem was probably out of contention to be Trump's VP pick after she wrote about killing her dog. But does this decrease her chances even further? I mean, there is a sizable chunk of the GOP among the voter base who think January 6th was some sort of patriotic event.
Definitely. It is sort of interesting to see Kristi Noem, who, as you said, until recently was very much in the mix to be, either in a cabinet position or maybe a vice presidential consideration. Very interesting to see her, take this stance and say that, there shouldn't be blanket pardons for January 6th rioters. Obviously, former President Trump has repeatedly said that he would pardon the January 6th rioters. He hasn't exactly provided specifics on who he would pardon or if he would pardon all of them. But, Governor Noem's comments, I think, just kind of underscore the degree to which, as you said, sort of defending those who were arrested on January 6th or sort of defending the conduct of those who were there on January 6th has become pretty normalized in the Republican Party to the point where, if somebody comes out and says, we shouldn't just pardon all of the rioters, we should do it on a case-by-case basis, it is actually kind of a newsworthy and eyebrow-raising comment. So I think the governor's comments really kind of show where things stand with the Republican Party and how far things have shifted as far as sort of sympathy toward January 6th in the last few years.
A controversial liberal Democrat is facing a major challenge for his New York congressional seat in a vote that's splitting factions of the Democratic Party. Representative Jamal Bowman campaigned with Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez over the weekend. More centrist Democrats like Hillary Clinton have lined up behind Bowman's opponent, George Latimer, a local county executive. Brett, what does this race say about the state of play inside the Democratic Party?
Yeah, this Jamal Bowman primary is really, I think, probably the most interesting primary left to be decided. And as you've pointed out, it's really kind of divided the Democratic Party along sort of progressive lines, centrist lines. I think there's clear frustration amongst some in the House that, there's not this sort of united front to back an incumbent like Jamal Bowman, that some in the party are backing a challenger to a sitting congressman, I think has certainly ruffled some feathers in the House. But, with this New York primary coming up, I think it'll be very interesting to see how it shakes out between Jamal Bowman and George Latimer. And certainly, I think it will be a good indication heading into November about where Democratic voters, where they might stand, whether they favor a more centrist candidate or whether they favor an incumbent who is certainly more progressive, who is more outspoken, who has been a little bit more controversial and in the news. And I think Democrats might sort of use this as something of a bellwether in New York as they not only seek to win the White House, but certainly seek to regain control of the House. And some of these New York districts, flipping them will certainly go a long way toward doing that for Democrats.
The House of Representatives is back in session tomorrow with spending bills on the docket. Republicans say they will not honor side deals hashed out between their former Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, and Democrats that were meant to smooth out these appropriations processes. What does that portend for these spending negotiations?
Yeah, it's going to be dicey, I think, as these spending negotiations tend to be, and certainly in an election year, no less, it's going to be even more sort of tension added, I think. But we've seen Democrats in the House have already sort of lined up in opposition to some of these spending bills that Republicans plan to vote on, and that portends poorly, you could say, for the fate of these spending bills in the Senate, which obviously Democrats control the Senate. So, maybe these bills pass in the House, but then they have to pass the Senate, which seems potentially unlikely because it's controlled by Democrats. And that's how we get sort of this gridlock and this looming spending fight in an election year. So, if Republicans dig in on this and they refuse to honor those agreements, as you said, that were struck during debt ceiling negotiations last year, that could really be a sign of what could be a really messy spending fight to come. But certainly the first step of this is all House Republicans being on board and being in line, because their majority is very narrow. So, that's the first step. But after that, I think, it could certainly be a bit of a slog to get these spending bills passed.
All right, Brett Samuels, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
The judge presiding over the classified documents case in Florida is hearing arguments today on whether former President Trump will be placed on yet another gag order. Prosecutors argue the former president should be barred from making public comments that could endanger the lives of FBI agents working on the case. It comes after Trump falsely claimed that agents who raided his Mar-a-Lago home in 2022 were out to kill him. Trump's lawyers say any gag order would improperly silence the presumptive Republican nominee. Trump faces dozens of felony charges in that case, accusing him of illegally hoarding top secret records at his home. The Justice Department is calling for Boeing to face criminal charges after they say the company violated a settlement with families of crash victims. Following 2 fatal crashes in 2021, Boeing avoided criminal liability in exchange for designing and enforcing an ethics program. But prosecutors say that did not happen. Boeing could face a fine of $24 billion or an additional agreement that requires them to devote funds to maintaining safety measures and quality control. Families of the victims continue to push for legal consequences. Boeing claims they have not violated any terms. The DOJ and Boeing are currently in negotiations on what's next. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimo. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.